Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into complex ideas and hopefully surface with the insights you need to understand the world just a little bit better.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're kicking things off with an absolutely stark contrast. It's a literal fence line division between two radically different realities, just feet apart.
Yeah. Imagine, if you will, peering through a barrier that separates two cities, both named Nogales.
Right, Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
It's truly one of the most striking geographical divides you can find, I think. And it immediately poses this profound question.
So let's paint the picture. On one side, Nogales, Arizona in the U.S. What's life like there?
Well, you'll find an average household income hovering around $30,000 a year. Most teenagers are in school, they finish it. Adults are generally high school graduates.
Okay, standard stuff for a developed nation, mostly.
Pretty much. Residents enjoy consistent access to vital public services, reliable electricity, functioning sewage systems, decent roads, a robust public health infrastructure. There's a fundamental expectation of law and order. Contracts are generally upheld. Property rights are, relatively secure.
And politically.
Crucially, citizens actively participate in a democratic system. They can freely elect their leaders, mayors, congressmen, president. There's a palpable sense of agency. A belief that government is, at least supposed to be, accountable to them.
Okay, that's one side of the fence.
And then you simply look south, across that very same fence, to Nogales, Sonora in Mexico.
And the picture changes dramatically.
Yeah, it really does. The average household income plummets to roughly, one-third of its northern neighbor.
Wow.
Tragically, infant mortality rates are significantly higher. Public health provisions are sorely lacking. The roads are often in pretty bad shape.
And law and order?
There's a pervasive sense of lawlessness, frankly. Higher crime rates, a constant struggle against corruption. It feels very different.
The outline mentioned difficulties for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, if you're an entrepreneur with an idea, trying to open a business becomes this bureaucratic nightmare. You often hear about having to grease palms just to navigate the regulations, deal with politicians who can seem inept or self-serving.
It's incredible. It's the same climate, the same general location.
Sometimes even the same families, with ties stretching across that border.
Yet the outcomes are profoundly, agonizingly different.
And what's truly fascinating here is that this isn't just some anecdotal curiosity. It's the very foundation upon which a really critically acclaimed and influential book builds its entire argument.
Right. And that's what we're diving into today. The book, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by Daron Acemoğlu and James Robinson.
Exactly. This book tackles that monumental age-old question that has puzzled economists, historians, policymakers for centuries. Why do some countries flourish while others seem stuck in poverty? It tries to reveal the deep structural reasons behind global inequality.
And it's clearly made a huge impact. It's not just us saying this is important.
Oh, absolutely not. Its insights have resonated across academia and the policy world. You've got Nobel laureates praising it. Gary S. Becker, for instance, commends how the book makes a compelling case that inclusive political institutions are the key.
How so?
By supporting and fostering inclusive economic institutions, they create sustained prosperity. And this, he argues, effectively prevents bad regimes from getting locked in that vicious spiral of underdevelopment.
That term, vicious spiral, already hints at the book's core concepts.
It does. And Peter Diamond, another Nobel laureate, adds to this. He highlights how the book doesn't just, restate old ideas, it fundamentally challenges them.
Challenges what, specifically?
The conventional wisdom. Diamond emphasizes the book's core assertion that it's man-made institutions, not the lay of the land or the faith of our forefathers, that ultimately determine a country's wealth.
That's a powerful reorientation, as you said, shifting the focus from geography or culture to, rules.
Man-made rules and systems. And Francis Fukuyama, another big name, goes even further. He describes the book as offering a convincing theory of almost everything to do with economic development. That's high praise.
It certainly is. It sounds like a profound exploration into the very fabric of national success and failure.
And as we'll unpack, the book argues it all boils down to the institutional choices societies make, consciously or unconsciously over time.
That's a truly empowering thought, in a way, but also maybe a bit daunting. If societies aren't destined for poverty or prosperity by geography or culture, but by the rules they choose. Well, let's unpack that central argument.
Okay.
The book's foundation rests on these two intertwined concepts. economic and political institutions. They aren't separate silos, are they?
No, not at all. They're deeply connected, constantly influencing each other. It's like a dynamic dance that shapes a nation's destiny.
So let's define them. Economic institutions first. What exactly are we talking about?
When the book talks about economic institutions, it's really digging into the fundamental rules of the economic game. How is property owned and protected? How do markets function? Who gets to innovate? Who benefits from that innovation? How is wealth distributed?
So the nitty-gritty rules that affect everyday decisions.
Precisely. These aren't just abstract ideas. They're the bedrock of everyday economic life. They shape incentives for everyone. Do you save your money? Do you invest it? Do you risk starting a business? Do you bother trying to invent something new? The book argues these institutions are the immediate drivers of whether a country experiences poverty or prosperity.
So if they encourage broad participation and reward innovation,
You'll likely see growth. If they stifle participation, protect monopolies, make property insecure, you probably won't, at least not sustained, broad-based growth.
okay, that makes sense. And then we have political institutions. How do they fit in?
Political institutions, as the book defines them, are the structures that dictate how political power is distributed and exercised. Think about it. Who gets to make the rules? Who gets to decide on the economic institutions themselves? How are leaders chosen? Crucially, are there checks and balances on power, or is it concentrated in a few hands?
So political institutions determine the economic institutions.
That's the book's core argument. It posits this hierarchy of influence. Political power ultimately shapes the economic rules of the game.
That distinction is really crucial, and this leads us straight into the book's critical dichotomy: inclusive versus extractive institutions.
Right, and how they create either a virtuous or a vicious circle.
Let's start with the ideal, the virtuous circle. Inclusive institutions. What do they actually look like on the ground?
Okay. Inclusive economic institutions are characterized by several key things. First, secure private property rights, meaning you can own assets and trust the state to generally protect that ownership.
Okay, that seems fundamental.
It is. Then, an unbiased legal system, one that applies fairly to everyone, not just the elite or the well-connected. The state also needs to provide essential public services. Basic infrastructure like roads, ports, communication networks, plus education, maybe basic healthcare. These are crucial for a productive population.
What about markets and competition?
Absolutely critical. Freedom for individuals and businesses to enter and exit markets. This fosters competition, drives innovation, and ideally a level playing field where success depends more on talent and effort than connections.
So these institutions encourage participation.
Exactly. They actively encourage technological innovation, they promote broad-based investment in people's skills and education, and they mobilize the diverse talents of a wide cross-section of the population. This broad participation, where, anyone with a good idea has a shot at pursuing it, is vital for sustained economic growth.
So those inclusive economic institutions are the engine. What kind of political system keeps that engine running smoothly? What's the political twin?
The political counterpart is what the book calls inclusive political institutions. These have two key features. They need to be sufficiently centralized.
Centralized? That sounds potentially counterintuitive.
Well, centralized enough to maintain law and order across the whole territory, enforce contracts, and provide those essential public services we just talked about. You need a state that actually functions.
Okay, makes sense. And the second feature?
They must also be pluralistic. This is crucial. Pluralistic means political power is broadly distributed in society, not concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite. And there have to be significant institutionalized constraints on how that power is exercised, checks and balances, rule of law, etc.
So centralized enough to work, but pluralistic enough to prevent tyranny.
Precisely. This structure prevents any single group from easily hijacking the state and setting up extractive systems just for their own benefit. It safeguards the inclusive economic framework.
And that creates the virtuous circle you mentioned earlier.
Yes. Inclusive economic institutions tend to create more equitable distribution of resources, or at least opportunities. This, in turn, helps sustain those inclusive political institutions because it creates a broader base of empowered citizens who have a stake in this system and will resist attempts to make it extractive.
It's a feedback loop. Each strengthens the other.
Exactly. It makes it harder for power to become overly concentrated and exploited. It's a compelling lens to view national development, I think.
Definitely. So how does the book apply this to somewhere like the United States? We often think of it as a hub of innovation.
The book attributes the United States' historical economic success, its ability to produce generations of innovators like Edison or Gates or Jobs, largely to political institutions that gradually and often contentiously emerged, particularly after the colonial period, gaining momentum maybe around 1619 with the Virginia General Assembly.
A gradual emergence.
Very gradual and often fought over. But over centuries, these institutions worked imperfectly to dismantle old monopolies and privileges, guaranteeing more equal access, not perfectly equal, but more equal to finance, education, legal protections.
So the key was enabling more people to participate.
That's the argument. It ensured that those with good ideas, regardless of their background, had a better chance of actually benefiting from them, rather than being shut down by entrenched elites or simply lacking the capital or legal standing. It was a long, messy journey towards dismantling privileges and establishing a more level playing field.
That sounds like the ideal path, or at least a path towards prosperity. But what happens when that feedback loop works in reverse, when institutions conspire not to build, but to plunder?
Ah, yes. That's the extractive side of the coin. And it is, as you said, much darker.
So define extractive institutions.
Extractive institutions are, well, pretty much designed, either explicitly or by effect, to extract resources and wealth from the money for the benefit of a narrow elite. They typically feature insecure property rights. Your assets can be arbitrarily seized, heavily taxed, or regulated away.
So the opposite of security.
Exactly. Access to markets is often limited, perhaps through state-granted monopolies or heavy favoritism towards cronies. And there is often a deliberate suppression, or at least a lack of encouragement, for innovation.
Why suppress innovation? That seems counterproductive, even for the elite in the long run.
Because innovation is disruptive. It involves creative destruction, which we'll talk more about later. It threatens existing power structures and economic arrangements. Why would an elite encourage a new technology if it might empower potential rivals or destroy the source of their own wealth, like, say, a monopoly they control?
Right. Protect the status quo, even if it means stagnation for everyone else. And the political twin of these extractive economic institutions, is it just concentrated power?
Precisely. Extractive political institutions concentrate power, real decision-making power, in the hands of that narrow elite. And crucially, they place very few, if any, meaningful constraints on how that elite exercises power.
So they can basically do whatever they want to maintain control and wealth.
Pretty much. These elites use their unchecked political control to shape the economic institutions directly to their advantage, ensuring a continuous flow of resources and wealth upwards.
And that's the vicious circle.
That's it.
Yeah.
Extractive economic institutions are structured by the elite to keep the wealth flowing their way, and they absolutely depend on extractive political institutions for their survival and enforcement. It creates this self-reinforcing system that perpetuates poverty and inequality for the majority.
Any key examples the book uses to illustrate this?
A really powerful one is the Spanish conquistadors in the Americas. When they arrived, they didn't just conquer, they systematically imposed institutions like the encomienda.
We mentioned that earlier, the forced labor grant.
Yes, it granted them vast tracts of land and, critically, the right to compel indigenous people to work for them, often under brutal conditions. This, along with other systems like the Mita mining draft, backed by an absolute colonial political structure serving only the crown and the colonial elite, was explicitly designed to extract resources, gold, silver, agricultural produce from the indigenous population for the benefit of Spain and the colonists. It wasn't about fostering broad-based prosperity in the colonies at all.
That immediately makes you think back to Nogales again, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Same geography, same human potential, but vastly different institutions imposed historically.
And this brings us neatly to the book's direct challenge to some long-held, maybe comfortable beliefs about why nations are rich or poor. The book really pushes back against geography, culture, or even ignorance being the main culprits.
Yes, that's a critical and, frankly, quite liberating point in the book.
Yeah.
For a long time, these were the go-to explanations for global inequality. Let's tackle the geography hypothesis first.
The idea that climate or location dictates wealth.
Exactly. That factors like being in the tropics versus temperate zones, or having certain natural resources, or being landlocked. These are the primary determinants of prosperity.
And the book says, no.
Pretty emphatically no. Using Nogales as Exhibit A. Two cities, side by side, same geography, same climate, vastly different outcomes. It's a powerful, immediate rebuttal. It makes it really hard to cling to the idea that the land itself dictates destiny.
But it goes beyond just Nogales, right?
Yeah.
The book uses historical examples, too.
Definitely. It delves into some compelling cases. Take the Middle East. This region led the Neolithic Revolution. Farming started there. The first towns were in modern Iraq, iron smelting in Turkey. It was incredibly dynamic technologically in the Middle Ages.
The center of innovation for a long time.
Absolutely. Yet today, much of the region faces significant economic challenges. The book meticulously argues this decline isn't primarily due to its climate or location, but rather the institutional legacy, particularly of the Ottoman Empire. After its initial dynamism, the Ottoman state became increasingly centralized and extractive, stifling private innovation and broad-based economic activity through heavy taxation, state monopolies, and insecure property rights outside the connected elite. Geography didn't change. Institutions did.
That's fascinating. Flipping the script on a region often defined by its geography, what about the colonization of the Americas? Jared Diamond's argument is quite famous there.
Yes, Diamond argued in Guns, Germs, and Steel that the Spanish conquered the Incas due to technological advantages stemming from Eurasia's longer history of agriculture and animal domestication.
Which gave them guns, steel, and diseases the Incas lacked.
Right. But the book, Why Nations Fail, points out something crucial. Once exposed to Spanish technology, the Incas or other indigenous groups should theoretically have been able to adopt and adapt those technologies relatively quickly. Catch-up growth is common.
But that didn't happen.
No, quite the opposite. A larger income gap emerged over centuries between Spain and its former colonies like Peru. Today, the average Spaniard is more than 6 times richer than the average Peruvian. The book argues this huge divergence has little to do with the initial technological gap or agriculture, and everything to do with the intensely extractive institutions, the Spanish-imposed institutions, deliberately designed to suppress indigenous advancement and funnel wealth to the colonizers.
So the institutions prevented catch-up.
That's the argument. Similarly, the book points to Japan and China. Geographic factors simply can't explain why these nations experienced centuries of relative stagnation followed by periods of incredibly rapid, explosive growth. The mountains and rivers didn't change. Something fundamental about their internal rules and incentives did.
Okay, so the geography argument seems pretty weak according to the book. What about the culture hypothesis? This is a persistent one. The idea that prosperity is linked to cultural traits, norms, maybe religion, like Max Weber's Protestant ethic.
Another major target for the book. Again, it uses Nogales powerfully. The people on both sides of that fence share a broadly similar culture language, historical background, often family ties, yet their economic outcomes diverge sharply.
So culture can't be the primary explanation there.
It seems unlikely. And the book makes a crucial point about things like trust, often cited as a cultural impediment in places like Mexico.
Right, the idea that lack of trust holds back development.
The book argues that low trust is often an outcome of poor institutions, not a cause of poverty. If you live under a corrupt government, an unreliable legal system, or face threats from powerful non-state actors like cartels, being distrustful of institutions and perhaps even strangers isn't an irrational cultural trait. It's a rational response to the environment you live in.
That flips cause and effect. Culture adapts to institutions, not the other way around.
That's a key insight the book pushes. It provides more historical evidence, too. Look at North and South Korea.
Same culture originally.
Exactly. One people, shared language, traditions, history. But after being divided along institutional lines post-World War II, they developed vastly different economic and political systems. This led to extreme differences in prosperity and, over time, arguably even diverging cultural norms related to the state, work, and society. The cultural differences we see today are largely a result of that institutional divergence, not its cause.
What about Africa? The book mentions the Congo Kingdom.
Yes, a fascinating case. When Europeans arrived, the Congolese weren't resistant to Western things. They were actually eager to adopt technologies like guns, iron, tools, even literacy and dress. But how do they use them?
How?
Primarily to intensify the slave trade. Why? Because their existing political institutions were absolutist and extractive. The new technologies were channeled by the elite to enhance their power and wealth through capturing and trading people, not towards broad development. It wasn't a cultural aversion to technology. It was existing institutions shaping technology's use.
And the Protestant ethic argument, that specific link between Protestantism and capitalism?
The book tackles that directly. It points out that France, a predominantly Catholic country, pretty much matched the economic performance of Protestant nations like the Dutch and English in the 19th century, once its own institutions started shifting towards greater inclusiveness after the French Revolution.
So institutional change mattered more than religion there.
Seems so. And even more powerfully, look at the huge economic successes in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, now China. These have absolutely nothing to do with Christian religion or Protestant work ethic. Their growth stemmed from profound institutional shifts, particularly towards more market-oriented economies and investment in education, not religious or deep-seated cultural changes in that sense.
So for Africa, the book argues that issues like low trust are historical outcomes.
Yes, an outcome of a long, often brutal history where institutions, exacerbated by things like the slave trade and exploitative colonialism, systematically undermined human rights, property rights, and communal bonds for centuries. It's presented as a legacy of extractive practices, not some inherent cultural deficit.
Okay, so if it's not the land and it's not the culture, maybe the rulers are just ignorant. That's the third hypothesis. The book refutes the idea that inequality exists because leaders just don't know how to make their countries rich.
Right, the ignorance hypothesis. Yeah. This often underlies traditional economic advice. If we just teach leaders the right policies, correct the market failures, they'll implement them and prosperity will follow.
But the book argues it's not that simple.
Not at all. The book argues quite forcefully and with lots of examples that leaders in poor countries often do know what policies would likely create broader prosperity. They aren't necessarily ignorant of economics.
So why don't they implement them?
Because, the book argues, those good policies would threaten their own power, their personal wealth, or the interests of the narrow elite group that supports them and keeps them in power. They prioritize what they see as good politics, staying in charge, rewarding allies, over what might be good economics for the nation as a whole.
It suggests bad policies are sometimes deliberate strategies, not mistakes.
That's the uncomfortable implication. It's a calculation, perhaps cynical, of power maintenance over national prosperity.
Is there a specific example from the book that really drives this point home?
A powerful one comes from Ghana in the early 1970s under Prime Minister Kofi Busia. He pursued these unsustainable expansionary policies and imposed price controls that were clearly leading the country towards economic crisis. His advisors knew it. Many economists at the time knew it.
So why do it?
Because, the book explains, these policies were good politics. They allowed him to transfer resources, effectively, to powerful urban groups, civil servants, the military, politically connected business people, whose support was absolutely crucial for his regime's survival. Even though it was devastating for the broader economy, especially the rural poor who were being taxed implicitly through low crop prices, political survival trumped sound economics.
So it's not about needing better economists, but about changing the political incentives of the leaders.
Yeah, that's the core message. The book draws that sharp contrast between the U.S. and Mexico again, looking at their historical trajectories.
Not just at the border, but overall development.
Exactly. The book argues the divergence wasn't because, say, John Smith was smarter than Cortez, or FDR knew more economics than Porfirio Diaz. Both sets of leaders had ambitions. The crucial difference was the institutional constraints the country's presidents and elites were facing.
Constraints again?
Yes. U.S. leaders over time operated within an evolving system that increasingly, though imperfectly, constrained absolute power and protected broader property rights. Mexican leaders, by contrast, largely inherited and perpetuated a system fundamentally designed for elite extraction dating back to the colonial era. The incentives were just different.
And this applies elsewhere too. Africa, for example.
The book argues yes. Leaders in many post-colonial African nations often perpetuated insecure property rights, not out of ignorance, but because it enabled them to enrich themselves, reward their loyalists, or maintain power by buying support from key ethnic or military groups, even if it impoverished the majority.
And this dynamic isn't just at the top level, with presidents and prime ministers?
No, the book gives a really telling example of how even well-intentioned micro-level interventions can be completely sabotaged by the existing extractive institutions lower down.
Which example is that?
It's about the Seva Mandir NGO in India. They tried to tackle a common problem: chronic absenteeism among health workers in rural clinics. Their solution was simple: install time clocks to monitor nurse attendance.
Did it work?
Initially, yes. Attendance improved significantly when the nurses had to clock in and out. But within about a year, the whole scheme fell apart.
How?
The local health administration and the nurses themselves effectively sabotaged it. The time clocks mysteriously got broken. The administration started sanctioning huge numbers of exempt days for the nurses, making the monitoring pointless.
Why would they do that?
Because the existing extractive political institutions at the local level, the unchecked power of administrators, the lack of accountability benefited from the status quo where nurses could collect salaries without showing up. The time clock threatened their comfortable arrangement. It shows you can't easily fix a symptom when the disease is the underlying institutional structure. The local elite simply captured and neutralized the reform.
That's deeply pessimistic about bottom-up fixes in some contexts. What about top-down help, like foreign aid? That's often seen as a key tool for development.
The book offers a very sobering analysis of foreign aid, too. It dedicates significant attention to this. Take Afghanistan, for example.
Yeah.
Billions and billions poured in after 2001.
With the goal of building stability and prosperity.
Of course. But according to the book's analysis, a huge chunk of that aid was either siphoned off by corrupt officials, wasted on poorly planned projects due to lack of oversight, or, maybe even worse, it actually undermined the very state structures it was meant to strengthen.
How could it undermine the state?
Well, foreign aid agencies, NGOs, often paid vastly higher salaries than the Afghan government could afford. So they ended up hiring away the few skilled local bureaucrats, teachers, engineers, crippling the government's own capacity to function. It created perverse incentives.
So it became business as usual within an extractive system.
Pretty much. The book's core argument here is critical. Countries are poor because of their extractive institutions, the lack of secure property rights, the absence of reliable law and order, the dominance by predatory elites. These very same institutional problems mean that foreign aid, no matter how well-intentioned, often gets captured, diverted, or is simply ineffective because it can't address the root cause. It often flows into the pockets of the very elites upholding the extractive system. You can't, the book argues, engineer prosperity from the outside if the fundamental institutional incentives remain extractive.
It's clear, then, the book places institutions absolutely front and center. But it does raise the question: how did these vastly different institutional paths emerge in the first place? Why did England develop differently from Spain or Western Europe from Eastern Europe? It can't just be random, can it?
That takes us to what the book calls the weight of history, and how small differences can become massive divergences over time. It introduces two really crucial concepts here: critical junctures and institutional drift.
Okay, let's break those down. Critical junctures.
Critical junctures are major, often unpredictable events that significantly disrupt the existing balance of economic and political power in a society. Think big things like plagues, revolutions, the opening of new trade routes, colonization, maybe even climate shifts. They act like a fork in the road, a double-edged sword, the book calls them.
Double-edged how?
They can push a society towards more inclusive institutions, or they can push it towards more extractive ones. The outcome isn't predetermined by the event itself. It depends crucially on the conditions before the juncture hit.
Which is where institutional drift comes in.
Exactly. Institutional drift refers to the small, often seemingly minor or random, differences in institutions that accumulate between societies over long periods. Like genetic drift in biology. Maybe one society has slightly stronger local councils, another has slightly different inheritance laws, a third has weaker feudal ties. These differences might not matter much in normal times.
But they become critical at the critical juncture.
Precisely. These small, pre-existing institutional differences become incredibly consequential when a major shock hits. They act as the initial conditions that shape how a society responds to that shock, channeling it down one path rather than another, ultimately shaping its long-term trajectory.
Okay, theory makes sense. Let's make it concrete. The book uses the Black Death in 14th century Europe as a prime example of a critical juncture, right?
Absolutely. A truly devastating event. The plague wiped out, estimates vary, but maybe a third to a half of Europe's population in just a few years.
Unimaginable disruption.
Totally. And this created an unprecedented massive scarcity of labor. Land was suddenly abundant relative to people, which fundamentally shook the foundations of the feudal order, where lords controlled land and the labor tied to it.
So how did different parts of Europe respond? Let's start with Western Europe, particularly England, where the book traces the roots of inclusive institutions.
In Western Europe, and especially England, the surviving peasants found themselves in a much stronger bargaining position. With labor so scarce, they began to demand and often get reduced fines, lower rents, and lighter labor obligations from their feudal lords.
They had leverage.
They did. The book gives a vivid example from Eynsham Abbey, where so few tenants remained that they collectively threatened to leave unless the abbey agreed to new, much more favorable terms, essentially granting them greater freedom and turning labor dues into fixed rents.
Did the elites try to push back?
Oh, absolutely. The government passed things like the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force people back to work. But ultimately, the economic reality of labor scarcity gave workers significant power. This pressure, combined with pre-existing institutional differences in the West, slightly weaker lords, somewhat stronger towns and peasant communities compared to the East, pushed England gradually towards more inclusive institutions. Serfdom slowly withered away, leading to greater freedoms and eventually rising wages for common people.
But in Eastern Europe, the same plague hit, the same labor scarcity, yet a totally different outcome.
A starkly different outcome. In Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Prussia, Russia, the landlords generally had more power before the plague. They had larger estates, towns were weaker, peasant communities perhaps less organized.
So the initial conditions, the institutional drift, mattered.
Hugely. Faced with the same labor scarcity, these powerful Eastern landlords didn't concede ground. Instead, they used their coercive power to double down. They intensified serfdom, creating what historians call the second serfdom, binding peasants even more tightly to the land through increased labor obligations, restricted movement, and harsher laws.
Making institutions more extractive.
Exactly. Locking peasants into deeper poverty and further entrenching the power of the landed elite. The small institutional differences that existed before the Black Death were amplified by the critical juncture, sending the two halves of Europe down vastly divergent paths that lasted for centuries.
That's a powerful illustration. Let's fast forward a few centuries to another pivotal moment the book emphasizes, the Glorious Revolution in 1688 England. How does that fit the framework?
The Glorious Revolution was another critical juncture, maybe the culmination of earlier ones. It represented a decisive victory for Parliament over the Stuart monarchs' repeated attempts to establish a more absolutist monarchy, like those in Spain or France.
What were the pre-existing conditions, the drift, that made this outcome possible in England?
The book highlights that even before 1688, English monarchs, like Elizabeth III and the Stuarts, constantly struggled with Parliament, especially over taxation. Unlike the Spanish kings, who had vast silver revenues from the Americas and were less reliant on legislative approval for funds, English monarchs often had to negotiate with Parliament. This gave Parliament a degree of leverage, a small but crucial institutional difference.
And other factors.
Another critical juncture mentioned is the lucky English victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. The book argues this opened up the Atlantic trade routes more fully to English merchants, sailors, and adventurers, creating a new dynamic class of people outside the traditional landed aristocracy, who had a strong interest in secure property rights, free markets, and constraints on arbitrary monarchical power.
So the Glorious Revolution solidified Parliament's power.
Profoundly so. Post-1688, Parliament gained firm control over state policy, especially finances. This led to a significant, decisive shift towards more inclusive institutions. Property rights were strengthened and, crucially, enforced more reliably by courts that were increasingly independent of the crown.
Including intellectual property?
Yes, including patents for inventions. James Watt's steam engine patent in 1775, protected by Parliament, is a direct example the book uses. This encouraged innovation. Arbitrary royal monopolies, like the Royal African Company's control over the slave trade, were challenged and often abolished. Chief Justice Holt's ruling in 1689 against such monopolies was a landmark.
And the state itself changed.
Yes, the state's capacity grew, but now under parliamentary control. The tax base expanded, allowing investment in things like the Royal Navy, which protected England's burgeoning global trade. This whole package, pluralism, secure property rights, state capacity directed towards supporting commerce, laid the essential foundation, the book argues, for the Industrial Revolution that took off in Britain a century later.
And this connects to that idea of creative destruction you mentioned earlier. How does that fit in with the Glorious Revolution and Industrial Revolution?
It's absolutely central. The book argues that sustained economic growth requires continuous innovation. And innovation inevitably involves creative destruction. New technologies, new products, new business models replace the old ones. Think cars replacing horse-drawn carriages or computers replacing typewriters.
Which creates winners and losers.
Exactly. And the losers often include powerful established interests, firms, industries, workers with specific skills, and crucially, political elites whose power might be tied to the old ways. These groups, quite rationally from their own perspective, will often resist the change, resist the innovation, resist the creative destruction.
Because it threatens them.
Precisely. The book gives that poignant example of William Lee, who invented an early knitting machine, the stocking frame, back in the late 16th century. He sought a patent from Queen Elizabeth I and later James I.
And they refused.
Yes. Not because they didn't see its potential efficiency, but, according to the book's interpretation, because they feared the social and political instability it might cause. Displaced hand knitters could riot, threatening public order and ultimately the monarch's own power. The elite feared the disruption.
Contrast that with James Watt after 1688.
Exactly. Post-Glorious Revolution, Watt's steam engine patent was protected by Parliament, even though steam power would eventually displace countless traditional workers and industries. The political institutions had shifted enough that the perceived long-term benefits of innovation, supported by a broader coalition in Parliament, including merchants and industrialists, outweighed the elite's fear of short-term disruption. Similarly, the Luddites, artisans smashing new textile machines in the early 19th century, illustrate that resistance from economic losers is real and understandable. But in post-1688 Britain, the state ultimately sided with innovation, not with suppressing it.
So the willingness of political institutions to allow creative destruction is key to long-term growth.
It's fundamental, according to the book. Powerful groups will almost always oppose economic progress if it undermines their economic privileges or political dominance. Inclusive institutions are needed to overcome that resistance.
It's not just about starting on a good path, though. The book also stresses that progress isn't guaranteed. Even places with early successes can reverse course, right?
Absolutely. It's not a one-way street towards inclusivity. The book highlights ancient Rome and the Republic of Venice as cautionary tales.
How so? They both seem like early success stories.
They were initially. The Roman Republic had institutions with inclusive elements: elected magistrates, laws like the 12 Tables, checks and balances between the Senate and assemblies. Venice became a mercantile powerhouse with an elected leader, the Doge, and the Great Council, which initially brought broad commercial interests into governance. Both experienced significant growth.
But it didn't last.
No. In Rome, the Republic gradually gave way to the empire under figures like Augustus. Power became concentrated in the hands of emperors, property rights became less secure, subject to imperial whim or confiscation during civil wars. The fear of creative destruction also became apparent. Emperor Vespasian famously rejected a labor-saving device for transporting columns, reportedly saying, "You must let me feed my poor commons," fearing unemployment and unrest. Widespread slavery also acted as a major brake on innovation. Why invent labor-saving machines when you have slaves?
And Venice, what happened there?
Venice's ruling mercantile elite gradually performed what the book calls the serrata, or closure. Starting around 1300, they made membership in the Great Council hereditary, effectively closing off political power and economic opportunities to newcomers. They created a closed oligarchy. This preserved the wealth of the existing elite for a while, but it stifled competition, innovation, and social mobility, ultimately leading to Venice's long economic decline relative to other European powers.
So even partial inclusivity can be rolled back if the elite manages to close ranks and make institutions more extractive again.
Exactly. It shows the constant tension and the fragility of inclusive institutions.
This dynamic of imposing or adapting institutions is also incredibly clear in the impact of colonialism, particularly in the Americas and Africa.
Yes, the colonial experience is a massive theme in the book, illustrating how institutions imposed from outside or adapted under external pressures shaped long-term destinies.
We touched on Spanish colonialism already. Highly extractive from the start.
Overwhelmingly so in the areas they prioritized. The encomienda, the mita, especially the horrific conditions in the Potosi silver mines, the repartimiento de mercancías, forcing indigenous people to buy goods they didn't need at inflated prices, Trajan, forced human porterage. These were all designed to extract wealth and labor for the Spanish crown and a small colonial elite. This institutional legacy, the book argues, is a primary reason for the persistent poverty and inequality in much of Latin America.
But you mentioned a contrast, areas the Spanish neglected.
Yes. The book highlights places like Argentina and Chile. These regions were initially considered less valuable by the Spanish because they lacked the dense, settled agricultural populations of Mexico or Peru and didn't have obvious, easily exploitable gold or silver mines.
So being neglected was actually better.
Paradoxically, yes, in the very long run, because there was less incentive for the Spanish to impose the most brutally efficient extractive systems like the mida or large-scale encomiendas. Different, somewhat less extractive local institutions had more space to develop, which arguably gave these regions a slightly better starting point centuries later. It's a grim irony.
Now, contrast the Spanish model with the English colonial experience, say, in Jamestown, Virginia. It didn't start out inclusive, did it?
No, definitely not. The initial setup under the Virginia Company was highly extractive. They imposed martial law, forced labor, communal farming with little individual incentive, basically trying to run it like a military camp to extract resources for investors back in England.
But it failed.
Largely, yes. And the book argues why it failed is crucial. Unlike in densely populated Mexico or Peru, where the Spanish could coerce vast numbers of indigenous people, Virginia had a much lower indigenous population density, and critically, the English colonists themselves had options.
Options? Like what?
They could simply run away, escape into the vast unexplored frontier. They could try to survive on their own, or even join indigenous communities. The Virginia Company just couldn't coerce them effectively in the same way the Spanish could coerce the Incas or Aztecs. Labor was scarce and mobile.
So the company had to change strategy.
They had to. Out of desperation to attract and retain settlers, they made pragmatic shifts. In 1618, they introduced the headright system, granting 50 acres of land to anyone who paid their own passage or the passage of another settler. This created private property incentives. And in 1619, crucially, they established the General Assembly, giving adult white men a say in colonial laws and taxes.
Wow, so inclusive institutions emerged not from high ideals, but from the failure of extraction.
That's the book's argument in this case. It inadvertently sowed the seeds of private property, representative government, and ultimately democracy in what became the U.S., driven by the specific conditions on the ground that made the preferred extractive model unworkable. It shows how critical junctures and local conditions interact.
Let's turn to Africa. Colonialism there, and particularly the interaction with the slave trade, had a devastating impact described in the book.
Absolutely devastating and complex. The Atlantic slave trade acted as a massive, continent-wide critical juncture, interacting with existing African institutions in often catastrophic ways.
How did it interact with existing institutions?
It created perverse new economic opportunities, especially for powerful coastal or near-coastal kingdoms like Congo, Dahomey, or Asante. They could trade enslaved people captured in warfare or raids inland for European goods, especially guns.
Guns, which then fueled more warfare to capture more slaves.
Precisely. It created a horrific feedback loop. The trade often intensified existing political absolutism, as rulers used European weapons to centralize power and wage war on neighbors or their own people. It systematically destroyed or warped existing institutions that might have provided some security or fostered local production. Property rights became incredibly insecure. Not just land, but people themselves could be seized and sold at any moment.
So it made institutions even more extractive.
Dramatically so. The book argues the slave trade led to widespread warfare, state collapse in many interior regions, demographic devastation, and a deep-seated legacy of insecurity and mistrust. This reversal of state development and destruction of local institutions crippled economic progress for centuries, leaving deep institutional scars still visible today.
And even after formal colonialism ended in the 20th century, the book argues many newly independent African nations struggled to escape these extractive patterns. The weight of history was just too heavy.
Yes, that's a major theme. Post-independence leaders often stepped into the shoes of the colonial rulers, inheriting states designed for extraction, not development, and frequently replicated or even intensified those extractive practices.
Any specific examples?
The book gives a striking, almost unbelievable example from Sierra Leone under President Siaka Stevens. To consolidate his power and weaken political opponents who drew support from the Mende people in the interior, Stevens literally had the railway lines connecting that region to the coast pulled up and sold for scrap metal in the 1970s.
He destroyed vital economic infrastructure.
Deliberately. To prevent his opponents from mobilizing or benefiting from trade, he was willing to cripple a whole region's economy to maintain his political control. The book compares this to Tsar Nicholas I in Russia, who feared that railways would spread dangerous ideas and mobility among his serfs. It's that same logic. Suppress development if it threatens elite power.
That's incredible. And South Africa's apartheid system is another key example.
A profound example of institutions designed for extraction. The 1913 Natives Land Act is highlighted. Inspired by this flawed idea of a dual economy, it forcibly allocated 87% of the land to the white minority, around 20% of the population at the time, and crammed the African majority onto the remaining 13%, often the least fertile land.
What was the purpose?
To destroy African independent farming and rural prosperity, the book mentions the successful Fingo farmers as an example of what was destroyed, and create a dispossessed, cheap, and easily controllable labor force for the booming white-owned mines and farms. It systematically institutionalized racial inequality and exploitation, the very definition of an extractive system.
It really sounds like this iron law of oligarchy is often at play, as the outline mentioned. New leaders, even those who come in promising radical change or revolution, often just end up perpetuating the same old extractive systems, just with themselves at the top.
That's a crucial mechanism driving the persistence of the vicious circle, according to the book. New leaders inherit systems with highly concentrated power and wealth, and the temptation to simply use that system for their own benefit rather than undertake the difficult and risky task of fundamental reform is immense.
Can you give an example?
Look at Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. He came to power in the late 19th century after decades of instability under figures like Santa Anna promising order and progress. But what did he do? He quickly consolidated power, violated property rights, especially communal indigenous lands, and granted lucrative monopolies in sectors like banking, railways, and resources to his close circle of friends and allies, the cientificos.
So modernization, but still extractive.
Exactly. It was a continuation, the book argues, of the same fundamental extractive pattern established by the Spanish conquistadors centuries earlier, just adapted to a late 19th century context. New face, new rhetoric, same game of elite enrichment at the expense of the majority.
So the names change, maybe the ideology shifts slightly, but the underlying structure of extraction often remains remarkably resilient.
That's the argument. The book also points to Egypt under Hosni Mubarak. During the privatization drives in the 1990s, Mubarak, his sons, and their politically connected allies known as the whales, benefited immensely. State-owned monopolies weren't necessarily broken up and open to competition. They were often simply transferred into private hands, usually those of regime insiders.
Like the Gianaklis wine monopoly mentioned in the outline.
Precisely. It ensured that the economic benefits of privatization flowed primarily to a narrow, politically connected elite, reinforcing their wealth and power, rather than fostering broad-based growth. It looked like reform, but acted like extraction.
What about revolutions that explicitly aim to overthrow the old elite, like in Ethiopia?
Another example the book uses to illustrate the iron law. When Mengistu Haile Mariam and his military committee, the Derg, overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, they proclaimed a radical socialist revolution. But what happened?
They became the new dictators.
Effectively, yes. Mengistu and the Derg quickly concentrated all power in their own hands, ruthlessly eliminated opponents, the Red Terror, and implemented disastrous collectivist agricultural policies that led to famine and further impoverishment. They became the new emperor, demonstrating that simply replacing one set of autocrats with another, even under a different ideology, rarely breaks the vicious cycle if the underlying institutions remain fundamentally extractive and power remains unchecked.
And Soviet communism itself, intended as a complete break, a new equitable system. How does the book analyze that?
Despite its revolutionary goals, the book argues that Lenin, and especially Stalin, established a new elite, the Communist Party nomenclatura, and enforced its rule through extreme coercion, from criminalizing workplace absenteeism to the vast network of gulags.
But didn't the Soviet Union achieve rapid industrialization, at least initially?
It did achieve some growth, particularly in heavy industry, but this was growth by fiat, by forcefully reallocating resources and labor according to central plans. What it fundamentally lacked, the book stresses, was creative destruction and genuine technological innovation.
Why?
Because the system suppressed individual initiative, private property, market competition, and the free flow of ideas. You can't, the book argues, force people to innovate effectively by threatening them. True, sustained innovation requires freedom, incentives, and the ability to challenge the status quo, all of which were absent. This ultimately led to technological stagnation and economic decline relative to the West.
And this pattern of extractive control under different guises continues in more recent examples, like North Korea.
A stark contemporary example. Under Kim Il-sung's Juche ideology, private property was outlawed, markets banned, basic freedoms ruthlessly curtailed. The book cites accounts like that from Kwang Byung-H's brother, showing how even relatively privileged individuals lacked basic amenities, highlighting the systemic failure to provide for citizens.
And specific policies reinforce this.
Absolutely. The 2009 currency reform wasn't just an economic measure. The book interprets it as a deliberate act of expropriation. It was designed to punish anyone who had managed to save money through black market activities, effectively confiscating their wealth and ensuring people remain poor, dependent, and thus less able to challenge the regime. All while the elite, like Kim Jong-il, indulged in importing luxury goods. It's a conscious strategy, the book argues. Keep the population poor to keep the regime secure.
Or Uzbekistan, another post-Soviet state mentioned.
Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Islam Karimov essentially maintained and adapted the old Soviet extractive structures. His regime forced farmers to grow cotton at artificially low state-set prices, often using forced labor, including school children, during the harvest.
While the state profited from exports.
Exactly. The Karimov family and their cronies profited immensely by selling the cotton on the global market at much higher prices. Meanwhile, the farmers remained impoverished, unable to switch to more profitable crops. This was combined with heavy censorship, banning books, and suppressing dissent. It's a classic example of post-Soviet extractive institutions benefiting a narrow elite.
And back in Latin America, the book points to Guatemala as another example of these long-term, deeply entrenched patterns.
Yes, showing how colonial legacies persisted. In Guatemala, the descendants of the Spanish conquistadors, a landed oligarchy, maintained power for centuries. They adapted old extractive labor systems like the repartimiento, forced labor draft, for new export crops like coffee. Laws like Decree 177 in 1877, along with vagrancy laws and debt peonage, umbrella system, trapped indigenous Mayans and forced labor on plantations for minimal wages.
And political repression reinforced this.
Absolutely. President Jorge Ubico, who ruled with an iron fist from 1931 to 1944, took it to an extreme. He reportedly banned words like workers, unions, and strikes from official use. Why? Because he feared that industrialization and an organized workforce would threaten the elite's supply of cheap agricultural labor and challenge their political dominance. He actively resisted creative destruction and broader development to maintain the extractive status quo.
It's chilling how similar patterns emerge across different continents and time periods, and the U.S. South after the Civil War fits this mold too.
It's a crucial and deeply troubling American example in the book. The period of redemption after Reconstruction saw the old planter elite swiftly regain control. Many had avoided the worst of the war due to exemptions for large slaveholders, so they were still there.
And they immediately set about controlling labor again.
Yes. They implemented harsh black codes, vagrancy laws, enticement laws, making it illegal to hire a black worker who had left a previous employer. All designed to restrict black mobility and ensure a cheap, controllable agricultural workforce, mimicking systems like Guatemala's repartimiento in their effect.
And the political system locked this in?
Critically, yes. The Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877 led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This allowed the planter elite to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and eventually full-blown Jim Crow segregation. These measures systematically disenfranchised black voters and poor whites, creating a one-party democratic regime completely dominated by the planter class and their interests.
And they actively blocked progress.
The book argues they did. Southern politicians consistently blocked federal investments in infrastructure, education, or anything that might modernize the South's economy or, crucially, give black workers more options and bargaining power. They deliberately kept the South largely rural, poorly educated, and technologically backward to maintain their control over cheap labor, ensuring the persistence of extractive institutions for nearly a century after the Civil War.
This sounds incredibly grim. It paints a picture of these vicious circles being almost inescapable. If elites always fight to maintain power and block change, is there any hope?
It is a grim picture, and the persistence is remarkable. But the book doesn't end there. It argues that the vicious cycle can be broken, though it's difficult and often requires specific circumstances.
So how? What are the pathways to inclusive institutions? What breaks the cycle?
The key factor the book highlights is the emergence of broad coalitions within society. Transitions towards inclusive institutions are most successful when a wide cross-section of society, not just one competing elite group, becomes empowered and mobilizes effectively to demand change and constrain the power of the ruling elite.
So it's not just a palace coup swapping one dictator for another. It needs broader participation.
Exactly. It's about fundamentally shifting the distribution of political power downwards and outwards, so that the majority gain a voice and can hold leaders accountable.
Let's look at examples. The book discusses British gradual democratization as a key case study. How did that happen?
We saw how the Glorious Revolution was a crucial step, limiting the monarchy. But the move towards broader democracy continued over the next 2 centuries, driven by persistent pressure from below. Events like the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, where peaceful pro-democracy protesters were attacked by cavalry, actually backfired on the elite by galvanizing opposition. The fear of widespread social unrest, especially after seeing the French Revolution in 1789 and later the 1830 Revolution in France, made the British elite more willing to consider concessions.
What was the first major concession?
The first Reform Act of 1832. It wasn't universal suffrage by any means, but it significantly expanded the franchise beyond just the landed aristocracy, bringing in many middle-class men, particularly manufacturers and merchants, in the growing industrial towns. It broadened the coalition holding political power.
The people kept pushing for more, like the Chartists.
Absolutely. The Chartist movement in the 1830s and 40s was a massive working-class mobilization demanding universal male suffrage, secret ballots, pay for MPs, and other democratic reforms outlined in their People's Charter. They organized huge demonstrations and petitions. While the movement itself didn't achieve all its aims immediately, it kept the pressure on.
And later reforms continued this trend.
Yes. Groups like the National Reform Union and the Reform League continued campaigning. This sustained pressure eventually led to the Second Reform Act of 1867, which roughly doubled the electorate again, giving many urban working-class men the vote. Then the Third Reform Act of 1884 extended suffrage further into rural areas. It was a gradual process, taking until 1918 for full manhood suffrage and 1928 for equal suffrage for women.
And education played a role too.
Critically, the Education Act of 1870 committed the government to providing universal elementary education, which became free by 1891. Empowering the population with literacy and knowledge was fundamental to making democracy meaningful.
So the book sees this as a gradual, virtuous circle. The elite gave ground because the alternative seemed worse.
That's the interpretation. Faced with relentless, organized, and broad-based pressure, the elite repeatedly chose concession over risking a full-blown revolution that might sweep them away entirely. Each reform, while resisted, was ultimately seen as less threatening than massive social upheaval. They made tactical retreats using the rhetoric of law and order they previously defended to manage the change. It shows that even entrenched elites can be forced to change their calculus when faced with a sufficiently powerful and broad coalition demanding change.
What about the U.S.? The Progressive Era sounds like a similar dynamic, pushing back against a different kind of elite, the industrial robber barons.
Very much so. The late 19th century saw this incredible concentration of economic power in the hands of figures like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, through huge monopolistic trusts like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. This generated vast wealth inequality and fears that these corporations were corrupting politics and undermining democracy.
So a threat to inclusive institutions from within.
Exactly. But strong political movements rose in response. First, the populace, largely driven by farmers' grievances against railroads and banks, and then the urban-based progressives, who included middle-class reformers, intellectuals, and politicians from both parties.
And they achieved actual reforms.
Yes. This pressure led to landmark legislation aimed at curbing corporate power and making the system fairer. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 tried to regulate railroads, and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was the first major attempt to break up monopolies, though its enforcement was uneven initially.
And didn't investigative journalists, the muckrakers, play a big role here?
Absolutely vital, according to the book. People like Ida Tarbell, whose devastating expose on Standard Oil fueled public outrage, or lawyer Louis Brandeis, who documented financial manipulation and championed workers' rights, later becoming a Supreme Court justice. They used the power of a relatively free press to expose wrongdoing and shape public opinion.
So a free press is crucial for these broad coalitions to form.
It seems essential for informing the public and coordinating action. This public pressure, amplified by muckrakers and reform movements, led to further changes like the 17th Amendment, establishing the direct election of senators, taking that power away from potentially corrupt state legislatures, often controlled by corporate interests. It was another step in broadening political power.
In a more recent, incredibly powerful American example of breaking a vicious cycle is the civil rights movement in the South.
A profound transformation, and the book analyzes it as another critical juncture where specific factors converged to finally shatter the deeply entrenched extractive institutions of Jim Crow.
What were those converging factors?
Several were key. First, the Great Migration, the mass movement of millions of Black Americans out of the South to northern cities, starting around World War I, gradually reduced the planters' supply of cheap, captive labor. Second, the mechanization of cotton picking after World War II further reduced the economic dependence of the planter elite on large numbers of Black farm workers. Their economic incentive to maintain the old system, while still strong, was weakening.
And crucially, the activism.
Absolutely crucial. The growing organization, courage, and strategic brilliance of Black activists and organizations, epitomized by figures like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others, relentlessly challenged segregation and disenfranchisement through boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and legal battles.
But they couldn't do it alone against the state power of the South.
No, and this is where the federal role becomes critical, according to the book. Federal intervention was decisive. Starting with Supreme Court rulings like Smith v. Allwright in 1944, banning white-only primary elections, and culminating in the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, the federal government finally used its power to systematically dismantle the legal structures of Jim Crow and protect Black voting rights.
So it's a unique coalition.
Yes. A powerful, though often tense, coalition between Black activists in the South and federal institutions, the courts, Congress, the presidency, finally broke the unchallenged political and economic domination of the Southern planter elite, allowing the South to finally, albeit slowly and incompletely, move towards more inclusive institutions.
It seems like having some pre-existing inclusive elements at a higher level, like the federal government in the U.S. case, can be really important for breaking regional extractive systems.
That certainly seems to help provide leverage.
The book also discusses Botswana as a remarkable post-colonial success story in Africa, a continent often associated with extractive legacies. What made Botswana different?
Botswana's success is fascinating, and the book attributes it partly to, again, institutional drift-positive pre-colonial institutions. The dominant Tswana tribes had traditions of both state centralization, powerful chiefs capable of enforcing rules, and pluralism.
Pluralism.
Most notably through the Kagatla, a tribal assembly where, traditionally, anyone may speak. Commoners could voice grievances, criticize chiefs, and participate in decision-making. Chiefs ignored the Kagatla at their peril. They could be overruled or even deposed. This tradition of consultation and accountability provided a foundation.
And they made smart choices at critical junctures.
Very much so. The book highlights a proactive move back in 1895. 3 prominent Tswana chiefs actually traveled all the way to London. Why? To petition the British government directly to prevent their territory from being taken over by Cecil Rhodes' aggressively expansionist British South Africa Company, which was known for its extractive practices in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe.
And they succeeded.
Yes, they persuaded London to keep Bechuanaland, as it was then called, as a British protectorate, rather than hand it over to Rhodes. This arguably helped shield them from the harshest forms of settler colonialism and land expropriation seen elsewhere in southern Africa.
And after independence, their handling of diamond wealth was key.
Absolutely critical. When huge diamond reserves were discovered shortly after independence in the late 1960s, this could easily have triggered a resource curse, fueling corruption and conflict, as seen in many other African nations.
Right, it didn't.
No. Botswana's first president, Seretse Khama himself, a Tswana chief educated in Britain who understood both traditional institutions and modern governance, made a crucial decision. He pushed through legislation vesting all subsoil mineral rights in the nation, not in individual tribes or private entities.
So the wealth belonged to everyone, not just the local chief where the diamonds were found.
Exactly. This was revolutionary. It ensured that the diamond revenue flowed to the national government, which then, under Khama's leadership and guided by relatively inclusive political institutions, used it relatively wisely. They invested heavily in building a professional bureaucracy, providing public goods like infrastructure and education, and maintaining macroeconomic stability. Instead of fueling conflict, the diamonds funded state building and development, creating a virtuous circle.
A remarkable contrast to places like Sierra Leone with its blood diamonds.
A stark contrast indeed, highlighting how institutions mediate the impact of resources.
Finally, let's touch on China's incredible economic transformation since the late 1970s. How does the book categorize this? It seems like a paradox, massive growth under an authoritarian regime.
It is a paradox, and the book offers a nuanced analysis. The death of Mao Zedong in 1976, following the chaos and devastation of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, represented a major critical juncture for China.
And Deng Xiaoping seized that moment.
Yes. Deng and his allies repudiated much of Mao's radical legacy and initiated truly radical shifts towards inclusive economic institutions, even while maintaining and arguably strengthening the Communist Party's authoritarian political control.
What were those key economic shifts?
Things like the household responsibility system in agriculture, which effectively decollectivized farming and gave peasants strong incentives to produce more, ending the state's mandatory purchasing of grain at low prices, granting more autonomy and market exposure to state-owned enterprises, and critically, opening up the economy to foreign investment through special economic zones and later open cities.
So embracing market mechanisms and property rights, at least partially.
Yes, a significant move towards economic inclusiveness, unleashing entrepreneurial energy and productivity that have been suppressed for decades.
But the book doesn't see this as a triumph of authoritarianism.
No, quite the opposite. It argues that this growth was achieved despite China's extractive political institutions, not because of them. The Communist Party leadership under Deng calculated, correctly, that allowing significant economic liberalization was necessary for growth and stability, and that they could manage this without immediately losing political control, partly because Mao had eliminated all organized opposition.
So it was a pragmatic move by an extractive political elite to allow inclusive economic activity.
That's the interpretation. It unleashed tremendous growth. However, the book strongly cautions that sustaining this growth in the long term, and especially fostering the kind of cutting-edge innovation needed to reach high-income status, is inherently difficult under extractive political institutions.
Why?
Because true creative destruction often threatens powerful vested interests within the party-state apparatus, and because concentrated, unchecked political power is inherently unstable and prone to arbitrary decisions that can stifle investment and innovation. The lack of political pluralism remains a fundamental vulnerability, according to the book's framework.
Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. From that single fence in Nogales, we've journeyed through centuries of history across continents, exploring why some nations thrive and others stagnate. The book, Why Nations Fail, really does provide a powerful, compelling framework.
It really does. I think it beautifully illustrates how these economic and political institutions interact, creating these feedback loops, the vicious and virtuous circles, and how small, seemingly random historical differences, the institutional drift, can become hugely consequential when those critical junctures hit, sending societies down dramatically different paths.
It's a potent reminder that history isn't predetermined, isn't it?
Absolutely. The rise of Western Europe, the Industrial Revolution in Britain, Botswana's success, even China's recent growth, none of these were inevitable. They were outcomes of complex contingent processes shaped by institutional choices made, often under pressure or by accident, at crucial moments in time. Choices that either opened up opportunities for the many or deliberately hoarded them for the few.
And this framework offers a stark, maybe even uncomfortable, but vital lesson for how we think about development today.
I think so. The book powerfully argues that we can't just engineer prosperity in struggling nations by throwing foreign aid at them or offering technical policy advice if the underlying extractive institutions and the political incentives that sustain them remain untouched. So aid might even be counterproductive if it props up those institutions. It can be, or at least ineffective. The book suggests meaningful, sustained change requires confronting those root causes, challenging the grip of narrow elites, empowering broader segments of society, and building accountable, inclusive institutions from the ground up, or supporting those who are trying to do so. It's a fundamentally political process, not just a technical one.
Which leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. As the book suggests, China's extraordinary economic success over the past few decades has largely occurred despite its authoritarian, extractive political institutions, not because of them. There are even reports mentioned in the book of debates within the Chinese Communist Party itself about the potential need for political reform to sustain growth long-term and avoid the kind of stagnation that plagued the Soviet Union.
It's a huge question.
So, what do you think the future holds for nations like China, which are attempting this balancing act, maintaining rapid economic growth without fully embracing inclusive political institutions? Can that model be sustained indefinitely? Or does the logic of creative destruction and the need for broader participation eventually force a political reckoning?
And perhaps more broadly, what does China's experience and the framework of this book tell us about the long-term stability and fundamental fairness of economic development anywhere in the world if it's not accompanied by genuine political inclusiveness?
Something definitely worth mulling over. Keep thinking about it, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.